Kevin Martin here, your UT admissions guide. In this workshop, I've recreated and reproduced with permission a real UT Austin student application, and I want to walk you through what an admissions reviewer might be thinking as they're reading and trying to assess which admissions score to assign this applicant. We'll look at the essays and the resume and discuss the results at the end. I hope you enjoy this video.
I welcome you to this SAA drafting workshop where I'm going to walk you through a real student's SAA process going from their very first draft through to intermediate drafting stages where you're editing for structural and big picture content, and we'll go through line editing with concerns to style and grammar and word choice before finally doing a live proofread using the Grammarly software that I like to conclude all of my editing work with. It's important that I do these essay building workshops for a few reasons. The first is that there is a misconception, and a common one, and it's understandable that students read these highly polished essays that they see on 50 essays that get you into Harvard, or even on blogs like mine where I'm sharing you these polished SAA and UT short answer final drafts, and it's really hard to know or have context for how the essays get from the first stage to that final draft. Most drafts take a minimum of 3 tries and sometimes upwards of 5 or 6. Like the one we're doing today, I think went through 4 different versions before it got to the final draft. And so I think it can definitely skew a student's concept of what the average college admissions essay looks like, because they might read a couple of their friends or see these examples on books and blogs, but their data size is very small and very skewed either towards who they know, which are other high school students who are perhaps recent graduates who've had success in the college admissions process, or these highly polished examples of amazing essays that get quote unquote get students into their dream universities. And so I want to walk you through and sort of show you how some essays that end up very well, where they start from, and show you some things that I look for as both an admissions reader from my previous career and also now as an editor helping students build their best essays for maximizing their college admissions chances. So the SAA we're working on is a Macombs Business Honors applicant who eventually did gain admission, and you can view that application workshop in another video, Christopher Donadio. And so I'm going to show you where we start with the SAA Tell Us Your Story. And so the very first draft that this student wrote, I would say is pretty good. It's probably above average for the typical college essay. A lot of students will ask me, they'll say, hey, I've watched your admissions modules, and those essays and applications, they seem like super, super strong and effective. But is that really what a typical essays look like? And again, I've already shared that, things like professionals like myself, they're not going to share first drafts on their blogs because that doesn't make for content and material that people want to read. So that's why I'm lifting the hood here a little bit to show the process of how we've, built this essay from the foundations, all the way up to, to the final draft. And so, yeah, so this is, I would say, a fairly typical essay, and this is often the type of essay that a student would submit for their final draft. It's something they've written once, maybe their parents have helped them read it, or they have an older brother or sister who's helped them out, perhaps a teacher that's looked at it. But when students ask me what does an average essay look like, this is it, and I would say this is even above average for a first effort. And so right out of the gate, they're sharing about their mixed heritage, how their father is Italian American and their mother's Vietnamese, and they kind of give a vague overview of different traditions within their Vietnamese family. And then they kind of talk linearly about how their family made trips to go to Vietnam. And then we start to get to a bit of a story here. As soon as we stepped off the plane, I was hit with the heat of a wave of heat unmatched even by Houston summers. That's one cliche we'll talk about a little bit later. These Houston summers, we used to joke during file training that because most of our applicants applying to UT are from the state of Texas, they've essentially invented every superlative about sweating and blazing suns and suffocating heat and drenching humidity. And so one thing I look for, not necessarily in the beginning, but certainly later on, is avoiding some of these kind of heat cliches, but at least it's in the context of Vietnam and they're making a comparison rather than just talking about a really hot football practice. So they tell a nice story about how their mother's kind of trying to navigate a city that she hasn't been to in many, many years. They share a couple illustrations of different things that they've seen and observed. So we have some nice rhetorical devices here of, seeing, smelling, tasting. Then we have, a nice comparison of how life is both familiar and different being in Vietnam, and how they've heard Vietnamese spoken in Houston. And kind of a fun fact, Vietnamese is the third most spoken language in the state of Texas, behind, of course, English and Spanish. And so that's kind of a cool fact, that there's quite a large Vietnamese diaspora in the state of Texas. And if at any point you want to pause this video, feel free to. But so they transition to a return trip. So the first one is kind of an exploratory, example of how their mother is kind of reacquainting themselves with their former city that they grew up in. And this trip took place in a more rural community. Small Vietnamese women carried 50 kilograms of rice on their backs. Teenage girls acted as mothers towards their little sisters. These are both very nice sentences here where we get a visual. The reader has a visual illustration of what it is that the student is seeing. And so this is actually a very nice paragraph in and of itself. And we'll probably see some more of these sentences in the final version and subsequent drafts. So the theme here that they kind of wrap up at the end is how being both mixed ethnicity allows them to interact with and make friends with people from diverse backgrounds, because they've had a variety of different experiences and traditions within their own family, but then also having some experiences by going overseas and then having this special connection with on the mother's side. And so that's kind of the telling us their story. They're wrapping it up by saying that they're, someone that's, working towards inclusion. I come from two distinct cultures in one of the most diverse cities in the country. My experience in my community and my trips to Vietnam have molded me into the open, curious individual I am today. So again, this is a very well-written essay just right off the bat. And again, it's above average for the first drafts that I receive. And so we can start doing both these what I call structural suggestions. So structure means like the order of the paragraphs and so for example, we'll just start with the introduction here. So remember they had this nice story that they begin, and it doesn't really start until the end of the second and the beginning of the third paragraph where they stepped off the plane and felt a wave of heat. And I suggested that we move that paragraph immediately to the beginning. And I like to recommend students to start off with the action, and you can supply the background information later on. It's important to grab your reader's attention. You can imagine that your admissions reviewer is reading, dozens of these essays and applications each day, every day for a few months during the fall and the winter. And just because they're forced to read your essays, you should try and make it interesting for them. So you want to try and avoid being boring, and think of it in terms of blog articles or podcasts you like to listen to, or news articles, or something in pop culture or sports. That often the way that we click on an article to begin with starts with the headline. And so here the headline, you can think of it as the first sentence in the essay itself, but then also in the first paragraph, right? I mean, oftentimes we're going to click out or stop listening to a podcast if it hasn't immediately captured our attention. And one very straightforward, easy way to do that is just start with the action, start with a story, a specific moment, experience, anecdote. And so this is the introduction that will largely remain the same throughout the different versions of this, throughout the versions of their various drafts. So that's what I mean by structural suggestions, is in what order which paragraphs go where. Structure also depends on the content itself. And so what I like to do in the beginning phases of essay editing and revision is, instead of imposing my own edits or looking at the specific sentences or trying to make corrections and make things sound good, that stuff can come later. What I like to do instead is ask questions. And one form of question I like are questions for clarification. So for example, and I think it's very true, I see this with writing in both fiction and nonfiction books that are published. I see it, of course, in college essays. I see it even with people who are telling stories. Great storytellers are supplying details. They're pushing the narrative forward. And instead of just talking vaguely, for example, about in some of the customs that come with being in a Vietnamese family, my challenge is to ask them, which customs. Or is there a part of your identity that you connect with more strongly, particularly with mixed race, mixed culture backgrounds, sometimes students will resonate with their one side over the other side. And so these are all details that the reviewer is, certainly wanting to know. And it's something that you can supply and substitute, some customs with, a short phrase to say something related to food or culture or the way that holidays are observed, for example. It's also important to provide background information in this setting. And so he supplies this information. It was my mother's first trip to her homeland since the fall of Saigon. But there's no more context, and so it's important to continue developing and elaborating on this theme, even if it's just one sentence or two sentences, to try and build a little bit of sophistication and also, make the mother a little bit more human, because this is obviously a big trip for her. And, one way to demonstrate that you can communicate in a nuanced way is to talk about some of the other characters that might appear in your SAA or your short answers. I also like to challenge students if they're telling a story, especially if it's one where you're visiting a foreign culture or you're visiting a different city in the United States that you've never been to, is to, talk about some of these sense words, seeing, smelling, tasting, hearing, touching. And he has some good, observations like stray dogs rule the streets at night and crowds throng to cramped and noisy markets. And that's a nice sentence. But just like with the customs above, the food even tasted the same, just a bit better. This is a great opportunity to talk about your favorite food or describing different ingredients you enjoy eating or that you enjoy cooking with, or how those ingredients were similar or different to what you've seen before in Houston or in Vietnam. Here's another example of where to consider clarifying or elaborating. I couldn't believe the country experienced catastrophic wars just a few decades ago. And for example, I've been to Hanoi and, going to the museum. There's lots of different museums. That's a very central part of that experience. If you're a tourist or, like a Vietnamese student, for example, many of them will go to these museums or memorial sites. And this is another opportunity, again, to supply some of those details to make the essay a little bit more enriching. And it also provides some context to how the student is, shaping their own beliefs about the war between Vietnam and the United States in the 1960s and 70s. And again, I challenge the author here to talk about or to discuss how their mom might have felt returning to Vietnam now as a Vietnamese American. So here they talk about, I had drawn some information from the student's resume that they worked with a group called the Raglai, which are a very small minority in the Central Highlands in Vietnam. But here in the current version, we don't really learn anything about the Raglai. We don't understand why the student is there or why it's significant to work with this particular community. And so I just challenged him to provide a little bit more context about why this particular group is marginalized, the language that they speak, for example. And likewise, whenever they circle back to returning how these lessons in Vietnam have influenced the way that they see their high school and their own background, it's important to talk about, what kind of students are you interacting with, which cultures and family dynamics do they come from, what's their socioeconomic status, is this the result of the type of school you live in or the neighborhood or like sports team that you play on. And then what we want to do, another rule of thumb, in addition to being to clarify and to develop and elaborate as much as possible, is to avoid vagueness and instances where we're talking in generalities. So for example, you often see introductions that will start like this. Exposure to foreign cultures, customs, and beliefs make me more open to unfamiliar experiences and new people. I know not to alienate myself because after stripping away stigmas and surface level disparities, I've seen that we generally feel and act in the same way. This doesn't really add a whole lot to the essay. It's something that a version of this might make the final draft, but it's something that you can probably cut because effective stories are going to illustrate the point that you want to make, and you don't have to hammer your reviewer over the head by saying, 5 different ways that you want to be inclusive and embracing of different cultures and diversity. And so the text that you see here is already after some line edits, and so you can see that I've already began the line editing process where I started kind of line by line, striking different things to make it a little more efficient and word economical, and we'll go more in detail in line by line in the next version, but I just wanted to show you here that if you see areas in this first phase of structural editing, and again the SAA first draft is already in pretty good shape, and so it was quote unquote ready for some of this line editing, but I just wanted to show you that this is an already edited draft that has improved from the first one, but it doesn't have any of these descriptions or advice that I've supplied there with the structural editing questions. So for the third phase of this draft, I'm going to turn on the all markup. And it looks kind of crazy. I know there's like lots of lines and there's a lot going on here, but I'm going to just go through and accept some of these changes to start clearing some of this out. So we'll resolve. So in Vietnamese, my mother began asking for help. So instead of saying, and I heard her speak Vietnamese, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 words. We can condense that into 2 words. In Vietnamese, comma. Boom, we've already saved. Oops, not track changes, we want to accept. So we've already saved, 4 words right there. And here we're just cleaning up the sentence structure a little bit more, getting the tenses correct between I've heard countless times back home, not I have heard. It's easier to just keep it in the past or in the present perfect tense because it's something that they continue hearing into the present. Oops. And then accept. So my father is Italian American, comma, my mother's Vietnamese. Before my freshman year, sometimes students will often say freshman year of high school. Your reviewer obviously knows that you're in high school, you're not a college student. So anytime you say before, you can even say freshman year, for example. You don't even have to say like during freshman year, after freshman year. That's another way to save word economy space, given that we have word limits for these essays. We want to try and save space where we can. Here's another place where you can be more economical. So it had said, this would be my first time in a foreign country and the first time my mother would revisit her homeland. So you could just say it was my mother's first trip to her homeland since the fall of Saigon. We've communicated the same thing in half the words. So here we've adjusted some of the order of this paragraph a little bit. So it had said, I saw communist propaganda on the sides of buildings. Instead, communist propaganda posters in densely concentrated housing blocks contrast with life in Houston. So we've communicated a lot in one sentence. So what had taken 3 or 4 sentences, they've communicated in one. So we remove a lot of this and then condensed the sentence about stray dogs and the night market. And so we've cut this paragraph in half without really eliminating much of any details, for example. So again, it's about communicating the most in the least amount of words. So these instances of unfamiliarity are a little bit vague. So we'll say, despite initial jarring unfamiliar experiences, I started connecting to where I'm raised. Again, saving more space. Anytime you can avoid, especially when you're telling a story, you have what are called conditional words. So it's a conditional mood. Whenever you say like could, I could go to the store, I could walk my dog. It's kind of hypothetical, but instead, and it's not something hypothetical. This is something the student literally did in the past tense. I picked up Vietnamese phrases in the streets that I hear at home. Oops. And we already know that the Vietnamese phrases are used by their family in Houston. It's already given by the story. So that's what I'm looking for when I'm doing line editing, is to just see how we can rearrange some of the phrases to mix up some of the sentence structures a little bit. Sometimes you can just eliminate. So we have, I told them where we were from and they love asking questions. And you can just say they loved asking questions about what we thought about their country, culture, and food, because they already know that they're not from there. If they're not, like, for example, if the son is not speaking Vietnamese. So we want to avoid redundancies as well. So you get the idea here, and you can see how the essay starts to develop. where we're going through and just seeing what we can eliminate. So a lot about this phase of the process is editing or is trimming. So trimming is a really important skill. Again, we want to try and write as economically as possible. So I won't go through the rest of this here. Instead, we'll go down here to some more of the line editing. And so we've already developed in the previous version a much more succinct and economical version of this draft. And so here there's less details that need to be included. But we'll go ahead and show the simple markup since we've already done a lot of line editing here. And I'll show you some of the answers to some of those questions, for example. So, for example, customs that I had suggested that he write about. So we celebrate Lunar New Year Tet. We attend family gatherings for observing anniversaries of our ancestors who have passed away. That's much more rich detail than simply, some various customs that we have on our side. And then we have more of a context for the trip that the family took. I followed traditions from habit, yet felt relatively disconnected from my Vietnamese identity until visiting Hanoi the summer following 8th grade. So this is an example of how you can begin with the action and then supply the context and the setting later on. We have an exact time frame of when this is happening. It's in 8th grade. And it's also an easy way to say it's their first trip abroad, my first time leaving America. They don't have to spend an entire sentence saying that they've never left the United States. It was also my mother's first trip to her homeland since escaping by boat in 1979. So I'd suggested providing a little bit more context, and that's the context that they've supplied, which again just makes each little bit that you add here will develop a sophistication and also just make for a more enjoyable story. Because again, some of the best stories that I like, for example, are ones where I know what's going on and I have a reason for wanting to read further about the different actions that are happening within the story. This used to be 2 sentences: stray dogs rule the streets at night, and noisy crowds throng the market. But anytime that you can have a noun lead the sentence rather than an article or a pronoun, it just makes for, it adds up over time. Like communist propaganda posters, buildings, stray dogs, crowds. And so it mixes up the sentence structure. Instead of beginning every structure with I or the, it's nice to mix it up some. I also suggested that they talk about one of their favorite foods. So we have a really nice sentence here. With a local family, we cooked and ate my favorite dish. I'm not going to try and pronounce that. A Vietnamese savory crepe packed with shrimp, pork, and bean sprouts. And so when the prompt is asking us to tell us a story, this is exactly one way that you can do it. So before we had read, like, I was eating a lot of my favorite foods, now we have an exact description of the type of food that the student enjoys. And all of these things add up over time. It's not like talking about your favorite food is going to make for an amazing essay, but if you add details in 8 or 10 or a dozen different places, these will all surely add up over time. And here he's sharing more about his mother's experience visiting Vietnam. For my mother, visiting Vietnam seemed bittersweet. She described how it felt great to see her home and remember her childhood. And it's also complicated because it troubled her to see the remnants of the war that disrupted her life. My mother is usually reserved, but during the trip, she shared how she has recurring nightmares. By the end of the trip, I became curious in my mother's story and this otherwise neglected aspect of my identity. So by discussing the mother and providing a little bit more context about her emotional states, we then learn more about the identity of the student themselves. So that's one way that you can frame lessons that you're learning vicariously, or how a specific experience can force you to introspect. And then here we learn more about the raglie that they were working with, and they also talked about how they were traveling there. So again, answering some of these who, what, when, where, how, and why questions. And we have that similarities and differences paragraph that's came through, because that was pretty nice even in the beginning in the first draft. And then they're talking more about the friends that they have back home. So my classmates and friends are Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, and come from every corner, almost every corner of the planet. Some of my basketball teammates have only one parrot at home and struggle to cover the AAU team fees. And so here you can see how just adding in all of these little details and clarifications and avoiding vagueness just makes for such a more rich and well-developed essay than what we had before. And so they had this kind of rambling, I mentioned it was kind of a vague paragraph that they had concluded the previous version with. They added more to that. But sometimes it's better to just end the essay, like to just simply end it. You don't need to have this vague, like, let me sum up again and tell you in 7 more sentences what I've already told you. You can just simply say, I acknowledge that people and cultures have differences, which makes me the open-minded and curious person I am today. And what ended up happening with this paragraph is they spun it off into their diversity short answer. So through the drafting process, this is an excellent example of how writing a lot, writing as much as you can, trying to think about and dig a little bit deeper can oftentimes spin off to answer another supplement, honors essay, short answer that might be required for something else. So in the drafting phase, all writing is good writing, and it's always better to get a lot of content and trim and cut than it is to constantly trying to be adding stuff over and over and over in the later rounds. So let's conclude here with a brief proofread. I'll just clean up a few small things and kind of read this out loud. One thing I do like to read when I'm doing the final revision of an essay, and even in my own writing. So for example, in my book, Your Ticket to the 40 Acres, one of the last things I did before handing it off to my professional editor was to read the book from like page 1 all the way to the end out loud to myself, because you often catch some small things that might sound good whenever you're writing them in your head, but don't quite translate whenever they're in the written word. Let's see if Grammarly caught anything. Looks like there's a few small stuff. So the heat bombarded us as soon as we stepped off the plane. Crossing the tarmac, I couldn't believe the intensity of radiating heat waves, unmatched even by Houston summers. We cleared immigration and exited the airport. The sun fell on top of us. I'll add a hand. And I coughed from farmers burning their fields following harvest. Even the humidity felt foreign. In Vietnamese, my mother began asking for help. Although it's an unfamiliar language that I've heard countless times back home, somehow, even here, it sounded unfamiliar. My father is Italian American and my mother is Vietnamese. We celebrate the Lunar New Year, Tet. We attend family gatherings or observing anniversaries of our ancestors who have passed away. I followed traditions from habit, yet felt relatively disconnected from my Vietnamese identity until visiting Hanoi the summer following 8th grade, my first time leaving America. It was also my mother's first trip to her homeland since escaping by boat in 1979. I looked at the journey as a fun experience, but when the plane landed, I realized this trip would hold tremendous influence in my life. Communist propaganda posters and densely concentrated housing blocks contrasted with life in Houston. Buildings seemed haphazardly piled on top of one another with hundreds of precarious electrical wires crisscrossing rooftops and intersections. It surprised me how life seemed completely different. People sat on stools at every street corner. Stray dogs ruled the streets at night. Crowds thronged to cramped and noisy outdoor markets. I picked up Vietnamese phrases in the street that I hear at home. Okay, that's a nice sentence too. Importantly, and maybe surprisingly, the people were warm and welcoming, especially towards Americans. I couldn't believe the country experienced catastrophic wars just a few decades ago. Their faces lit up when we shared that we're American. They loved asking about what we thought about their country, culture, and food. Let's take a look at this one. By the end of the trip, change that to journey. By the end of our journey, I became curious about my mother's story. Remove the comma. Okay, all that looks good. Maybe remove that last sentence because we already know about the similarities and differences and the surprises. Yeah, once the surprises and novelty wore off, so it's okay to simply have the sentence end with a description. I've been surprised so many times that I've learned not to be overconfident in my assumption about anyone based on their culture, family situation, or religion. We are much more than labels. That's a nice sentence. You could even end the essay there. So if they needed to convert this to a Common App with a hard limit of 650, you could just even remove this final paragraph. This kind of summarizes things nicely. If I could relate with a 70-year-old grandmother living in rural Vietnam, it seems foolish to write a classmate off because they're from the quote-unquote bad part of town. Maybe just remove this phrase. Exposure to foreign places makes me appreciate where I come from and not fear others because of perceived differences. I acknowledge that people and cultures have differences, which makes me the open-minded and curious person I am today. Cultural differences. And then we can even just remove this sentence here because it's not adding a whole lot. There. So I think that sums up how we've gone from this very first SAA, which again, recall that it has a good foundation here. There's a lot of nice qualities that we eventually build upon, but the foundation here, it still requires, tinkering with the details, the context, adding more information about the setting, developing nuance by talking about some of the different characters in the essay, for example, their mother. And so although it looks kind of superficially the same on the surface, adding in all of these details and continuing to push the action forward really does help develop the essay overall. So just these little tweaks that happen through the process are how you can elevate an above average essay to one that's pretty strong. And the student did end up gaining admission to business honors, and so it's no doubt in part to what amounted to a very strong SAA.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment and subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can find more helpful information at texadmissions.com/blog. And in the information section of this video, I provide links to a free online email consultation if you're interested in potentially working together, and links to my book, Your Ticket to the 40 Acres, and my premium course, Getting into Texas Universities. Thanks, and I hope to see you again soon.